This is a video by Veritasium, the man who accidentally killed the most people. It's a video about leaded gasoline. Leaded gasoline did terrible stuff to humanity. You're gonna see here. I'm just gonna show you the important parts. I don't want this video to be really long. There we go.
Kettering wanted to find an additive which would increase the octane rating of ordinary fuel and eliminate knocking in high compression engines, so he hired 27-year-old engineer Thomas Midgley Jr. Midgley experimented with all sorts of compounds, from melted butter and camphor to ethyl acetate.
Melted butter? What would that do? Interesting.
And aluminum chloride. He later wrote most of them had no more effect than spitting in the Great Lakes. Ethanol was an interesting exception. It did stop the knocking, but you needed a lot of it, about 10% of the fuel mixture for it to be effective. That much ethanol would be expensive and hard to turn a profit on. And Midgley was really after an additive that was cheap, easy to produce, and effective.
That almost never turns out well. Trying to find a cheap additive.
Even at low concentrations.
It's just karma, I guess. We try to cut corners, then it comes back and bites us in the ass.
So he kept trying. Then he hit on tellurium.
Same thing with monocropping, for example. Or grain feeding cows. Yes, the cow grows faster and larger on a grain-fed diet and is fattier, but at what cost? At the cost of its meat being lower quality. Or farmed fish, for example. We feed farmed fish poison, and the meat is poison too. It just has to be that way. Fertilizers, for example. Fertilizers, yes, it makes the plants grow faster, and you can take that plant and feed them to cows. But the thing is, when the plant grows faster, like the plant grows slow for a reason. It grows slowly for a reason. So it can pull the right nutrients from the soil. That's why the plant grows slower. When you add the fertilizer, you artificially make it grow faster. So it doesn't take as much copper, for example. So the plant is actually copper deficient. And cows that were fed copper deficient grass are, guess what, also going to be somewhat copper deficient. And if we eat an animal that was somewhat copper deficient, we too are going to be somewhat copper deficient. That's just one example of one micronutrient, by the way.
It worked wonderfully as an anti-knock agent, but it had a terrible smell. You couldn't get rid of it by changing clothes or bathing. His wife was so offended by the stench that he had to sleep in the basement for 7 months.
Wow, that's crazy. I can't imagine that would be healthy. I can't imagine it's just the smell. It also has to be bad for like your respiratory system, because that's why stuff usually smells bad. Bleach, for example. The reason when you smell bleach and it burns your lungs, the reason for that is because it actually does burn your lungs. It does damage you. That's why it just makes you feel terrible.
Midgley wrote, "I don't think that although this doubled the fuel economy, humanity would suffer this smell."
Yeah, instead humanity suffered something else.
On December 3rd, 1921, after 5 years of working on the problem, Midgley found what he thought was the perfect solution: tetraethyl lead. That's a
lead. Yes. Lead.
Lead atom right there in the center. This additive was exactly what he was looking for. It stopped the knocking, it didn't smell, it was cheap to produce and readily available. Best of all, you only needed 1 part in 1,000 for it to be effective.
In a call to Kettering, Midgley said, "Can you imagine how much money we're gonna make with this?"
How much money? Yeah, money really is the root of all evils.
"We're gonna make $200 million, maybe even more." That is over $3 billion in today's dollars.
Now, for his discovery,
That's
the American
crazy.
Chemical Society gave him the prestigious Nichols Award, and they asked him to do a series of public talks.
Okay, but did no one say lead is toxic? It was known at the time. Like, lead was toxic. We knew that a really long time ago. Like, for over 200 years, I think. We did know that lead was toxic. I guess no one said, "Man, what are you doing? Adding lead to gasoline." Like, that stuff gets mixed in the atmosphere and we breathe it in. That can't be a good idea. Anyways.
But Midgley declined. He and Kettering patented the process for making tetraethyl lead, and they called their new additive ethyl, perhaps so it might be confused with another common additive, ethyl alcohol.
They didn't put lead in the title now, did they? Of course they didn't.
They made no mention of lead. Then they teamed up with 3 of America's largest corporations, General Motors, DuPont, and Standard Oil of New Jersey, to form the Ethyl Corporation.
Their marketing was brilliant.
No man can look at the amazing record of accomplishment here in this research division without confidence that these men are going ahead with an eye to the future, looking for new facts and principles which will make things better and make life easier for all of us.
Make life easier. Look at the marketing. Has nothing to do with cars even.
At the 1923 Indianapolis 500, the top 3 finishers all used ethyl, and the demand for leaded gasoline took off. To keep up, Ethyl Corporation had to build a new chemical plant in New Jersey, but the project began terribly. Within 2 months of operating, dozens of workers
Actually,
fell
wait.
ill.
There was, when he showed this, I remembered when he showed this. There was this woman. I think she was an F1 driver. I saw it on Paul Saladino's channel. She had heavy metal poisoning. I wonder if it was from the cars, like the chemicals they used for the car fuel. Because they can't be using the same fuel that we normally use in normal cars for like F1 races, right? Yeah, they're probably adding all sorts of poisonous metals to that fuel. That's definitely why she got heavy metal poisoning. I'll review that video someday too. It's an interesting one.
Began terribly. Within 2 months of operating, dozens of workers fell ill with lead poisoning.
No wonder.
5 of them died.
Whoa.
To address the public outcry, Midgley held a press conference, and there he poured tetraethyl lead onto his hands, and he inhaled it for a full minute. He claimed he could do
That's not a good idea.
this daily without harm. But Midgley knew the dangers. The reason he had turned down the public talks was because he spent much of 1923 in Florida, where he himself was recovering from lead poisoning. He didn't go anywhere near his company's product if he could help it.
Lead is dangerous.
Yeah, man. Of course, he did know that it was poisonous. Like, he had to. Everyone knew that lead was toxic. That was a known fact at the time. He had to know, especially if he was a chemist. Like, there's just no other way. Like, you have to know that. That's a super obvious fact. Everyone knows that. And everyone did know it back then too. It wasn't an unknown thing, lead poisoning. We did know it. But for money, he just didn't care, or somehow made himself believe that it wasn't bad, since he did it on himself too. Maybe he's that delusional, who knows.
Even in small doses. It mimics calcium in our bodies, so there's no efficient way to get rid of it. And like calcium, lead can be stored in bones for years, meaning it can continue to poison the body long after the initial exposure. The organ most sensitive to lead is the brain. Lead breaks down the myelin sheath around axons and prevents
Heavy metals in general wreak havoc on your nervous system.
the release of neurotransmitters. That's why common symptoms of lead poisoning are headaches, memory loss, and tingling in the hands and feet. And children are particularly susceptible. Lead exposure can cause permanent learning disorders and behavioral problems. And the dangers of lead had been known for hundreds of years.
Exactly.
Already in 1786, Benjamin Franklin remarked that lead had been used for far too long, considering its known toxicity.
Yes, obviously, like, this is so funny. Of course, nowadays, we recognize lead being poisonous more. Lead isn't really used in places, at least in modern, like, in the Western countries, of course, in India and stuff. Who knows what they're doing in India, China? Who knows what they're doing? Probably all their pipes are lead. But nowadays we don't really use it in the Western world, but instead we just use other poison. Red 40, for example, or Yellow 5, tartrazine, all these food colorings, which are actually drugs. They don't just add the food coloring to color the food. It actually acts as a drug and makes you addicted. All sorts of food additives, preservatives. Vegetables are toxic too, of course. But
you will observe with concern how long a useful truth may be known and exist before it is generally received and practiced.
Oh my god, that's it. That's a great quote. That's an amazing quote, actually. He really said that? Well, I mean, who knows if he actually said it. It might just be... But it's a good saying regardless, right? Who knows if he actually said it. History is mostly fake.
On. He would have been aghast to learn that nearly 150 years later, scientists planned to add lead to fuel. Doctors and public health officials from MIT, Harvard, Yale, and
so people did say stuff about it.
And the U.S. Health Service wrote to Midgley and warned them against producing tetraethyl lead. They called lead a creeping and malicious poison and a serious menace to public health. Their concerns were dismissed.
Yeah, because they're gonna make money. They most likely paid off some people. That's how it usually happens with, I'm just gonna say, other stuff, if you know what I mean. Other things that we use in the modern world that have heavy metals in them. I can't say it because of YouTube. Like, the video will actually get taken down if I say it. I really can't.
This model shows how just the right amount of fluid containing tetraethyl lead and dye is added to the gasoline.
No one doubted that a lot of lead was bad for you, but how much harm could a little lead do?
Well, in nature, there would be lead, of course. Like, there would be some exposure to heavy metals, obviously. It just would. But it would be so insignificant. And of course, in nature, we would be eating much better, and we would actually be able to detox even that little amount. We would still have some exposure to it, of course. That's why we can actually detox it. But nowadays, we have so many times more heavy metals in our system. Our body just cannot deal with it.
By the 1950s, millions of
We're only adapted to dealing with such low amounts.
motorists globally were burning lead in their cars and releasing it into the air. Some of that lead ended up on Claire Patterson's zircon samples, preventing him from...
This is the second part of this video.
He began by measuring lead in the oceans. If it were natural, he expected the concentration of lead to be the same regardless of depth. But if lead pollution had increased recently, it would be more concentrated near the surface. He took samples in the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans down to a depth of 4 kilometers. And sure enough, lead concentrations were nearly 10 times higher near the surface. Lead pollution was clearly recent, but...
Wait, don't they say deep sea fish have more heavy metals? Maybe that's true for other heavy metals. Interesting, that's actually interesting.
When exactly had it occurred? To find out, Patterson had to go to Greenland and Antarctica. Ice cores record the level of lead in the air going back thousands of years. The levels of lead in the atmosphere have been elevated for the last 4,500 years. All of it is due to human activity, mainly smelting ores to make metal. You can see the rise and fall of the Greek and Roman empires, the dip caused by...
Oh, that's crazy.
By the Black Death in the 1300s, and of course the spike in the 20th century due to industrialization and tetraethyl lead.
Oh my god, that is insane. That's crazy. Imagine the effects of this. Like, even when we were smelting ores, it's just almost insignificant. Imagine the hunter-gatherer times when we actually lived in nature. It's not even like 1%. Like 0.1% maybe of what we have now. That's what we're adapted to. That's the level, that's the safe level of lead in environments, basically.
So what did this do to people? Well, Patterson looked at the lead levels in the teeth and bones of recently deceased Americans, and for comparison, he measured the lead in bones and teeth of Peruvian and Egyptian mummies. Since they lived over 1,600 years ago, they would have been exposed to much less lead in their lifetimes. He expected to find modern Americans had about 100 times as much lead in their bones, but results...
Oh my god, was it more? Was it more than 100 times? Oh no.
Showed it was closer to a factor of 1,000.
Wow. Wow. What's there to say? And imagine now, just imagine all the other heavy metals. And now imagine all the other toxins other than heavy metals. That's just heavy metal. That's just a single heavy metal. One toxin of a toxin group. There are tons of other toxins that accumulate in the body and cause severe damage. That's insane. The kind of world that we live in. And they will try to tell you that you got sick because you drank raw milk. They will actually try to do that. Oh yes, well, you have 1,000 times more lead than the safe amount, but what's actually killing you is the raw milk that you're drinking, and the meat that you're eating. That's actually bad for you. Not your heavy metal levels being 1,000 times more than what's safe.
20th century Americans had 1,000 times more lead in their bones than their ancestors.
What the fuck?
Studies of baby teeth revealed that even lead exposure well below the level considered safe resulted in delayed learning, decreased...
because the level they consider safe, quote unquote, is the level of the modern American. Go look at the Mummy. That's the same safe amount of lead. That's the safe amount of lead that should be in your bones. Of course, you're gonna have less IQ, just
IQ,
less health.
and increased behavioral problems.
And there's a broad consensus.
And we wonder why anxiety, depression, ADHD is such a problem. We add toxins to food, we burn heavy metals into the air.
On the part of everybody except the lead industry and its spokesman, that lead is extremely toxic at extremely low doses.
A follow-up study showed that those with higher levels of lead in their baby teeth were many times more likely to fail out of high school. As a result of studies like these, the CDC's guidelines for the acceptable level of lead in children's blood dropped from 60 micrograms per deciliter down to...
Well, not that high school has anything to do with intelligence, but of course, if you're really stupid, you can't graduate, like, obviously. You're not going to be able to even learn slavery, which is what they teach in schools.
3.5. And as far as we know today, there is no safe level of lead. Globally...
Obviously, like, it's just something that we're trying to get rid of all the time. It's poison. It's toxic. Well, the quote-unquote safe amount would be the amount that's in that mummy, Egyptian mummy. That's the natural amount. That probably doesn't have any significant effects.
Lead is believed to be responsible for nearly 2/3 of all unexplained intellectual disability.
According to a study published in
Well, mercury is actually... I wish I could talk about this on YouTube. I hope some of you get what I'm talking about. Mercury is actually like 1,000 times more toxic than lead. And guess how children are being exposed to mercury at very early ages. Yeah, I'm not gonna say it. I don't want this video taken down.
2022, more than half of the current US population, that's 170 million people, were exposed to high levels of lead in early childhood. Those born between...
Oh my god. And what they consider low amounts is actually high. Because they're not taking that the level of lead that they found in the Egyptian mummies as the safe amount. They're taking it something that's much higher than that.
In 1951 and 1980 are disproportionately affected. The authors estimate that in aggregate, lead caused a loss of more than 800 million IQ points. The world is...
Of course, the way we measure intelligence is not perfect, but it still tells you something, right?
less intelligent today because of leaded gasoline.
But there are even more troubling correlations. The US saw a steady rise in crime.
What's more troubling than that?
From the 1970s to the 1990s. Then it abruptly declined. This graph looks eerily similar to a plot of preschool blood lead levels, just offset by 20 years.
The obvious question is,
oh my god, that's crazy.
Did kids who were exposed to higher levels of lead grow up to commit more crimes than they otherwise would?
Well, yeah, they're not... If you're really dumb, you're not really going to succeed in the slave system. You're just going to be more likely to participate in crime. Also, participating in crime isn't really a good idea. Like, you're very likely to get caught. And getting caught is terrible. Obviously.
You might think this is just a spurious correlation, but the same pattern appears in many countries, including Britain, Canada, and Australia. And we know there's a causal connection between lead exposure and antisocial or violent behavior. A study of 340 teenagers found that
Yes, brain damage.
those who were arrested were 4 times as likely to have elevated lead in their bones than similar demographic controls who didn't have run-ins with the law. Now, this doesn't mean
It's gonna be funny when we look back in a few decades, probably, and and laugh at what we're doing right now, or maybe cry over it. With mercury.
that lead is responsible for all of the increase in crime, but it's very likely responsible for some of it.
Now, it's tough to estimate the precise death toll of lead. One of its lesser-known effects is a hardening of the arteries.
That's no, it's the cholesterol, guys. It's the meat that humans have been eating for millions of years. That's what's killing you, not the 1,000 times more lead that's in your body.
Leading to increased cardiovascular disease. A study from 2018 found lead was likely responsible for 250,000 heart disease deaths per year in the US.
Assuming a constant rate over the past century, that amounts to 25 million deaths in the US alone. Globally, the figure may approach 100 million.
That's probably correct.
Most
Also, vegetable oils and refined sugars are not helping, certainly.
of those deaths are due to Midgley's decision to put lead in gasoline, a substance he knew firsthand was toxic, but he did it anyway to maximize profits. And the problem is not over. Current estimates of deaths caused by lead range from 500 to 900,000 per year. A 2020 UNICEF report warns that 1 in 3 children globally, that's over 800 million children, have blood lead levels at or above 5 micrograms per deciliter.
A lot of this lead now comes from batteries and industrial processes, but some is still due to Midgley's invention.
Now, after Midgley's success with ethyl, he was
Yeah, after you blow that poison into the air, where is it gonna go? It's gonna accumulate in the oceans, it's gonna accumulate in the ground. We're gonna just take it right back into our systems from the food we eat. Also, it doesn't help that nowadays we eat grains which are more likely to accumulate heavy metals anyways.
put in charge of another engineering project. GM wasn't just making cars, but also household appliances. And fridges had a problem. The 2 most common gases used as refrigerants were methyl formate and sulfur dioxide. One is highly toxic, the other is flammable. Midgley was tasked with creating a safer alternative, and in 1928
So he puts lead in that too? That's just comical.
he developed a non-toxic and non-flammable refrigerant, dichloro-difluoromethane. GM called this new product Freon, and to demonstrate Freon's safety, during the unveiling at the American Chemical Society, Midgley inhaled a lungful of this gas and blew out a candle. In the following decades,
It really sounds like he had zero self-awareness and zero consideration of his own health.
CFCs like Freon became very popular and were used as solvents and aerosols. The problem is CFCs are light and stable. When released into the atmosphere, they climb up into the stratosphere, where they can remain for 50 to 100 years. But if a CFC molecule is hit by an ultraviolet photon of just the right energy, it breaks apart, releasing a chlorine atom. And this chlorine atom can then react with ozone, breaking it apart into chlorine monoxide
Oh, the ozone layer. Yeah.
and oxygen gas. The result was another environmental disaster, the hole in the ozone layer. With less ozone, more UV light penetrates the atmosphere, increasing the rates of skin cancer.
Yeah, I mean, if you destroy nature, it's just gonna come back to bite you in the ass.